Now I have the pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. James Kemple. Dr. Kemple is a research professor at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. He serves as the executive director of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools. And this is a locally based research organization that conducts rigorous applied research to improve educational outcomes in the New York City schools. And previously, Dr. Kemple spent more than 18 years at MDRC, which is a well-respected nonpartisan social policy research organization. And there he directed the K-12 education policy area. He's an expert in the design and management of rigorous evaluations of real-world education and social programs. And at MDRC, he headed the widely regarded Career Academies evaluation, which he's going to talk to you about today. He's a very popular speaker. He's presented in multiple states across the country, often to policy-oriented audiences. He's given talks for the National Conference on State Legislators, National Governors Association, the Council of Great City Schools, the Council of Chief State School Officers, and many others. We're very interested to learn that Dr. Kemple comes from a long line of teachers. He's married to a teacher. He used to be a high school math teacher. His kids now are in the education field as well, I believe he said. And so he has education and teaching in his blood. And he also told us he's an avid hiker and biker. He's biked all over in the Northwest and even all through Ireland. And so he tells us he's anxious to check out the great biking trails here in Wisconsin sometime. He'll have to come back and do that. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. James Kemple. Career Academies, an evidence-based approach to preparing youth for adult success.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the terrific introduction. I have to, first of all, do a little catharsis. I'm a hard-nosed empiricist, which, as the introduction said, when you're living and growing up with a lot of educators is a big disadvantage because everybody else is grounded in the real world while you're out there trying to figure out sort of, can I measure something and then shed light on it for somebody else to understand and act on it. And it's always a challenge, I find, to speak in front of groups who are really out there either in the trenches as practitioners or in policy circles trying to figure out how to make good decisions about how we allocate resources and organize ourselves to serve the populations of people that we represent. And I'm usually sort of trying to think hard about how can I make this stuff relevant and grounded other than just sort of going through statistics and data. Although last night I had a really interesting experience. I was out walking around when I got in, and there was a bottle on the side of the road. I figured I'd be a good citizen, pick it up, and it was a rusty thing that I just sort of rubbed off to see what it said, and a genie popped out of the bottle. And I said, ooh, good opportunity here. And this is a tired old genie who's really kind of sick of granting the 3 wishes and says, you get 1 wish and that's all you get. I said, all right, well, you know, my parents are getting older, they love to travel, but they're not real good at airports anymore. And they want to go to Europe. Can you build a bridge from New York to Europe so they can drive? They really enjoy driving. And he said, come on, give me a break. Too much disruption to commerce and travel. Give me something easy. You want to win the lottery? I'll get you a $10 million lottery ticket. You want to create peace on earth? I can probably pull that off easier than the bridge. I said, no, I'm giving this seminar tomorrow. I'm giving a talk. It's legislators, policymakers. I have to try to translate some research that we've done into something that folks can really get their heads around and maybe even act on. He said, okay, that's interesting. Do you want the bridge 2 lanes or 4 lanes? So I know I've got my work cut out for me. Listen, I'm going to talk about a very high quality study that we did over 15 years when I was at MDRC based in New York. MDRC might be familiar to many of you. We've done a lot of work in Wisconsin over 30 years of doing rigorous research on a range of issues from education, welfare to work, family, and youth policy. And I want you to walk away with 3 key points when I'm done with this, I hope, as I go through my slides and through the key points. Number 1, I think what I've got here is a great follow-up to Bill's presentation because I'm going to talk about sort of what happens on the ground. Do we know anything about what really works to help young people make healthy transitions into the labor market? And I think the first point I want you to walk away with is that the evidence that I'm going to provide, I think, is probably unique in that it's one of the few studies that demonstrates that career and workforce preparation need not come at the expense or compete with college preparation. I'm going to tell you about some findings that demonstrate massive effects on young people's participation in the labor market, their earnings, even their other measures of transitions to adulthood, like family formation and forming two-parent households. And I think all of this came without having to have what we've seen over probably 100 years of career technical education, where the assumption is we're either going to go to work after high school or we're going to go to college. Pick it by the time you're a freshman in high school, and you're basically stuck with that. That's been our criticism of the apprenticeship models in Europe. That's different for us in the United States. We don't want to force students into that zero-sum choice. I think we've got really compelling evidence in this Career Academy study that that need not be the case. The second point is that the key to the impacts that I'm going to talk to you about, based on the evidence that we've seen in the field, really resides in the partnerships that were formed between employers and schools and school districts, and in particular in the set of work-related learning activities that young people participated in while they were in high school. There are other components to these Career Academy programs that I think are certainly necessary for effective programming, but they're by no means sufficient to create the kind of impact on labor market participation that I'm going to talk about here. So that's the second key point, is that these partnerships with employers and the work-related learning activities that students were involved in. The third message, I think, is that you really have to pay attention to and heed the warning labels that I think belong on these Career Academy programs. These are extremely hard to implement, and we'll hear from some practitioners after the three main speakers about what they have to deal with in implementing these programs with high degrees of fidelity. At the same time, I think we're seeing around the country, first of all, these are programs that have almost a 40-year track record of implementation and systematic expansion around the country. And there are now national standards of practice for what it means to be a career academy, with lots of technical support and efforts to build capacity in local school systems and among the employer community. So with those three messages, let me just dive into the findings here. The first thing is, let me just sort of frame out a little bit why these Career Academy programs, I think, provide us with some unique insights into what works to help young people make healthy transitions into the labor market without compromising on their capacity to get into and do well in a post-secondary education environment. Bless you. As I said, these have a 35, almost 40-year track record of implementation. It's an intervention with goals and core features that I think are important and very well aligned with our current aspirations for young people in high schools. It has a research tradition going back more than 25 years now. Much of that has been non-experimental work, in the sense that these are correlational studies where we've seen that higher access to these things are associated with higher outcomes, but not necessarily the causal kinds of evidence that we've been able to build at MDRC in our 15-year study, which is a randomized controlled trial. This study has been certified by a whole range of evidence clearinghouses as being in the top tier of evidence. This is real science with a randomized controlled trial, much like the kinds of evidence that's been built in the medical profession and public health, even in employment and training and welfare to work. It's unique in its rigor, in the depth, in terms of the types of things that we measured and how much time we spent in the field understanding young people's experiences, as well as what it took to implement these programs, and how long we were able to follow people. We followed the young people for 12 years, from the time they were in 8th grade all the way through 8 years after they were scheduled to graduate from high school. And more importantly than anything, it's one of those rare studies that actually shows that there are positive effects from these. Usually there's this inverse correlation between how good the study is and your likelihood of finding something positive at end. The more rigorous we are, the less likely it seems we are to find positive effects, and this has really sort of spun it on its head. What are these things? Typically, career academies are characterized by three central components. They're organized as smaller learning communities or smaller schools, either within schools or in standalone schools of between 60 and 100 students per class. They use a career theme to organize their curriculum so that students take a combination of academic courses as well as applied learning courses in the career theme area, which might be information technology, business and finance, health professions, engineering. We'll hear more about those themes, I think, from some of the practitioners that will be here. And as I said, most importantly, I think those first two pieces are necessary but not sufficient. The real impact, I think, derives from these employer partnerships that support a range of work-related learning activities. Their goals are aligned with, I think, the goals of most high school reform efforts in terms of efforts at dropout prevention, career development, and academic achievement, and pathways into the labor market and post-secondary education. As you'll hear, even though these are the goals for most of these programs, I think there has been different levels of success on each of those goals. For example, we don't see any impact on college, on academic achievement and educational attainment. That's not to say that the young people didn't achieve highly and didn't go on to post-secondary education and complete it at high rates. It's just that they were no more likely to do that than their counterparts in the control group that we have for this study. I'll talk more about that in a second. I'm going to just sort of give you the findings, and I'm pretty much going to be done with my presentation over the next 5 minutes. I'll go through more details, but I'm hoping there'll be more time for an exchange and for questions as I go through this. So the first thing is we looked very carefully at what happened to students while they were still in high school. The main things that we found were that these personalized learning environments produced very high levels of personalization, much higher than what their counterparts in the control group. We had students, all these programs were oversubscribed, so we actually worked with the schools to set up a lottery to choose among the eligible students who were interested in enrolling in the program. And most of these programs had more than twice the number of students interested and eligible for participation than they were able to serve. So we were able to use a lottery and set up a real control group. And by the way, this study took place in 9 different cities across the country. The young people who participated in the study, 83% of those students were Black or Latino. And that'll be an important set of overlay to the findings that we see here. All these high schools had graduation rates between 50 and 60% in their general student population. They were predominantly serving students from low-income communities. The students who ended up in our sample were students, most of whom had some history of prior low attendance rates in their middle school years or low achievement. I would say most of the students, however, came from this middle part of the distribution, not the lowest achieving students coming out of middle school and certainly not the highest achieving, someplace in something like the middle 50%. So that'll give you a sense for who was included in this study by virtue of the students who came forward to apply. The other thing we saw was a very large increase in students' exposure to a range of career awareness activities, work-based learning, and career technical education courses. These career awareness activities were job shadowing at employer sites, mentoring relationships with representatives from the employer communities, employer representatives coming into the school to give students talks on what their industry consisted of, what kind of education was required there, opportunities for students to go out to the workplace in a formal way through these internships, some of which were paid, some of which were not. And the third one was that we started to see, I think, to the extent that there were effects on dropout prevention, which didn't last actually because our control group eventually caught up and got a high school diploma. It took them longer than the students in our program group. Is that to the extent that there were benefits accruing academically, it was to students who entered the high school with characteristics that were typically associated with a high risk of dropping out or leaving school without a credential to help them make a transition to post-secondary education. And these were students entering high school with very low attendance rates or test scores, students from some low-income families, and there's a report that we have out that shows you more information about the dropout prevention effects that the program produced for those students. But there were limitations. The programs that we studied, and I think this is true of academies that we followed subsequent to this study, have very high attrition rates. Among the students who had initially applied and were admitted into the programs, fully 45% of the students eventually left the program. And some of those students we found, when we asked why they left the program, most of the students were leaving by their own choice. They had an opportunity to experience the health career courses or some of the work-based learning activities and found that that really wasn't for them. Other students moved away from the school or transferred schools. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Some of those were quite healthy choices. There were very few cases where students were either pushed out of the program or dropped out of the programs by virtue of actions taken on the part of the staff. A second thing is the uneven quality of curriculum integration and in some cases the quality of the internships, but particularly the instructional piece of this. This is one of the reasons I think while that is an important part of the programs, given the uneven quality of the teaching in these applied learning courses, it does, to the extent that we saw effects, it's probably not coming from that feature of the program. It was probably important in creating a healthy instructional and academic environment for young people, but it didn't add a lot of value to what the students would have gotten had they not been in the programs. So again, while that's important, there was enough unevenness in the way that was implemented that made me believe, based on the evidence, that the real impact was coming from the employer partnership piece of this and the range of career-related learning activities. And finally, we found, as I said before, little or no impact that I'll show you in a minute on a whole range of academic indicators, test scores, ultimate high school graduation rates, with the exception of this very high-risk group of students that was included in the sample, college enrollment, college persistence, and college completion. No impact. Now, I want to make clear that there's a big difference between outcomes and impacts. The outcome is the gross level of college going, which was very high for this population. The impact is what the programs caused as a change in college going relative to what students would have done had they not been in the program. That's our control group. So we see that, for example, about 55% of the students in this sample completed either a 2-year or a 4-year degree within 8 years after graduating from high school, but that was exactly the same percentage as the students in our control group. So high levels, but not an impact. So I'll come back to that in just a sec if we get to the slides. Post-secondary, this is really where the effects of the program kick in. We followed the students for 8 years after they were scheduled to graduate from high school, and we found, I think, probably among the largest impacts on labor market participation of any study, rigorous study that I'm aware of looking at youth-serving programs. Some of us are old enough to remember the old CETA programs. Anybody remember CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, the Job Training Partnership Act? For everybody who's under the age of probably 45 or 50, it's now called the Workforce Investment Act. And all of those programs were evaluated, particularly for youth, and finding that had very little impact on their post-secondary labor market participation. We got to a point, I think, where there was a mantra in the field of youth employment where nothing works for youth, quote unquote, and those folks who've been around long enough to follow the trends in youth serving, particularly on the employment side, really we've all been quite discouraged by the sort of litany of studies that have come out showing limited or no impact. Well, here we're seeing pretty significant, and particularly for young men and young men of color. So that middle thing where we see the impact of $3,700 per year, which is a 17% increase in earnings for young people, is accruing largely to young men of color, Black and Latino young men. Remember, 83% of this sample were young people from Black and Latino backgrounds. We also saw, as I said before, high levels of educational attainment, but no impact, positive or negative, from the career academies. And I think most interestingly for me, and most surprising, frankly, at the end of the day, was this residual effect on family formation and on independent living. We see effects, positive effects on young people being married and living with spouses and a child, students living independently, whether they're married or not. And much of this, I think, is coming out of the economic benefit and the labor market effects that we saw that I just talked about before. So that's basically the story of the findings. I'll show you a few graphs here just to give you a sense for what the data look like, and then I want to come back and just sort of start reading some of the warning labels here that I talked about as my third point here. So this is the trend in earnings for the young people in our sample. So that solid line there shows you the earnings progression for the young people who participated in the career academies. The dashed line is the control group. And I think for most of anybody who has studied youth programs, that's probably a fairly familiar trend where over time, if you get into the labor market, you're starting to see your earnings increase year over year. That shaded part at the bottom is the difference between the two lines. That's the impact of the career academy. That's the difference in earnings that the career academies produced. And we can make a real claim that it was the career academies that were responsible, the students' access to these career academies, that was responsible for that difference, given the kind of design that we used for this study, which is quite unusual in the field of education particularly. There we go. This is a little more detail on this. I'll show you the results for the young men. So the dark shaded bars here are the levels for in this case, the young men who had access to a career academy. The lighter blue bars are for the control group. The difference between those two bars is the impact of the program. And what you're seeing here is a positive impact on total earnings And total earnings, as you know, is a function both of how many hours per week you work and what your wages are per hour. It's also a function of the number of weeks that you work in any given year, but here we're just showing positive impacts on every component of earnings. So it's not just that students are working more hours at a low wage job or at a similarly waged job, but they're working more hours at a higher wage job, and they're working at those jobs over longer periods of time than their counterparts in the control group. And I think one of the most telling kinds of effects that we saw was the fact that young people in the Career Academy group were much more likely to make smoother transitions from job to job on a career path rather than disruptions in their employment over time that meant that they were either slipping back on the wage scale or not progressing in the same way as the students in the control group were. So again, every piece of the earnings calculation here, we saw positive effects. Effects for young women. Here's the post-secondary. This is just to make this point about the post-secondary completion rate. So here's our Career Academy group, and you see that half the students within 8 years of their scheduled graduation from high school had earned some sort of a post-secondary credential. Now these numbers are quite high. You see 21% of the young people having earned some sort of a certificate or license, 12% getting an associate's degree, and fully 16% getting a 4-year degree within 8 years of scheduled graduation from high school. These are high. Why do I say that these are high? Well, here's a nationally representative sample of people of young people from surveys that are given by the U.S. Department of Education. And what we did is a statistical match to find students of similar backgrounds by race and ethnicity, by prior achievement, by the kinds of schools and school districts they were enrolled in. And for a similar population of students from similar types of schools and districts, the completion rate is only 28%. So when you do this statistical matching, which is the way most studies are done in this field, we see a pretty big difference between our Academy group and the nationally representative sample of students. However, there's things that they're not being picked up in that nationally representative sample that are being picked up in the control group. And here's the real comparison you should be paying attention to. And as you all think about how to use evidence, it's the compared to what question that's most important. And when you do the right comparison, that's what this is. This is a comparison that really does control for things that are not usually measured by background characteristics like motivation, like just the fact that these young people came forward to volunteer and enroll in a special program like a Career Academy. That's part of what accounts for the difference between the two left-hand bars and the right-hand bar. But again, the conclusion here is that we see high levels of educational attainment, but no overall effect, positive or negative, from the Career Academies. Here's some of the outcomes looking at other transitional, adult transition indicators: married and living together with a spouse, being a custodial parent, and living independent with children and a partner apart from their parents' household. And again, these are quite unusual. I don't know myself of any other study that has been able to find effects of this magnitude on earnings, let alone subsequent effects on family formation and other adult transitional indicators. So here's I think some of the implications, and I'll get to the warning label. I think that this is showing, it's really rare evidence, that investments in these career-related activities during high school, during secondary education, can result in substantial payoff in the labor market. Secondly, I think they further demonstrate the feasibility, at least, and the fact that I think this need not be a trade-off between either college or a job. And at the same time, I think we're seeing that these are college preparatory programs. So I think anybody who's worried about the politics of college for all, we're seeing in Career Academies real college preparation here. The warning label, I think, is that I think it's important, first of all, in my view, based on the evidence. I think we'll hear from others who look at other pieces of these programs as being critically important. But from my view, from the evidence that I've seen, I think it's the primary value added is in the post-secondary labor market. The primary source of those effects is drawing from the partnerships with local employers and from this range of career-related learning opportunities that they present for students. I think the real risk here is that trading on this brand name, which is happening more and more, puts at real risk enough attention to that critical component And particularly when we hear things about the Common Core, I think there's a real risk in some ways that the Common Core is going to start boxing out the other kinds of learning opportunities, what somebody characterized as the soft skills. There's a worry about that. I think empirically we don't know yet. But I think there's some risk to that, and I think we saw it in some of the earlier rounds of school reform when, for example, there was a lot of money coming out to support what were called small learning communities. Well, most districts started to put together proposals where career academies were their small learning communities. And what that meant was we're going to do a good job of creating a personalized learning environment, and we're going to call it a career academy because that has evidence. In order to get a grant, I got to present something that has evidence of effectiveness, but they paid no attention to the other components of the program. I think that puts this whole sort of branding and this whole notion of what it means to be a career academy at some risk. And there's some resources, which I think are also included in your packet. So let me hold it there and see if there's any questions.